Hi, thanks so much for joining us today inside this lovely little Zoom window. My name is Jake Gagne, and I'm the Jock Reynolds Fellow in Public Programs here at the Yale University Art Gallery, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our e-study tour speakers for today. We have Alyssa Waters, who is the Florence B. Selden Fellow in the Department of Prints and Drawings, and Jenna Marvin, who is the Marsha Brady Tucker Fellow in the Department of Photography. Alyssa and Jenna will be speaking about how contemporary American artists Kara Walker and Carrie Weems depict histories of enslavement through their prints and photographs, respectively. So they'll each give a presentation of about 5 minutes, and then there will be some dialogue, and then we will open it up for audience questions. So you can submit questions to our speakers using the Q&A feature, but we ask you to please wait until the presentations have ended before you submit your questions, just so that we can keep track of them a little more easily. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat feature to reach a staff member at any time, and we'll do our best to help. And finally, for more information about the artworks from today's talk, we will be posting links and information in the chat, and you'll also get a follow-up email with a checklist of the artworks. So with that, thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you, Alyssa, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you, Jake, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first e-study tour of the fall. At the gallery, both Jenna and I are very involved with the James E. Duffy Study Room for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, located on the 4th floor of the Louis Kahn building. Normally, the study room is extremely active with visits from classes, students, scholars, and members of the general public who make appointments with us to see various objects in the gallery's prints and drawings and photography collections. We also frequently host public programs in this space, including monthly thematic tours. While we're conducting today's program virtually, we hope that when the study room reopens, you'll visit the space and see the objects that we're discussing today or other works of interest to you in person. In light of recent events such as the murder of George Floyd, the protests that occurred in the wake of this tragedy, and a heightened awareness of the racial inequalities that continue to pervade American society, the theme of today's program seems especially relevant and urgent. The two artists we're discussing, Kara Walker and Carrie Weems, both grapple with the challenging histories of the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent enslavement of Black people in the Americas. Walker is perhaps best known for works like this one that feature life-size silhouette figures made of cut paper that she mounts directly onto gallery walls to create theatrical vignettes that explore the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. However, today I'm focusing on her portfolio of prints entitled Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, Annotated. Comprised of 15 large-scale prints, each approximately 4.5 by 3 feet, the portfolio grapples with the ongoing erasure of enslaved peoples and their experiences from historical narratives of the American Civil War. In the making of these prints, Walker overlaid silhouettes of Black figures, identifiable as such by stereotypical, exaggerated features, on top of images from the first anthology of the Civil War, which upon its publication in 2 volumes in 1866, claimed to be, quote, the fullest and most complete history of the Civil War, which at this time is possible, end quote. The illustrations, which initially appeared in Harper's magazines published throughout the Civil War, rarely portray Black people, and when they do, these figures are marginalized. Walker sees the anthology's illustrations as, quote, the landscapes that I imagine exist in the back of my somewhat more austere wall pieces, end quote. Walker's silhouette editions reintroduce Black people to a narrative from which they have largely been erased. In this print, Alabama Loyalists Greeting the Federal Gunboats, for example, Walker has overlaid a large silhouette of the profile of a Black woman on top of an image of Union supporters rushing to greet Northern warships. And yet, identifiable only by her outline and lacking any individuating features, the Black woman is still semi-effaced. Moreover, she is not a participant in the Alabama Loyalist narrative. She doesn't join the crowd of white people hurrying to the docks. Rather, she exists in a separate space, in fact, one that's closer to us. Moreover, the woman stands between us and the scene behind, disrupting the narrative of the Harper's illustration. The image caption, Alabama loyalists greeting the federal gunboats, all in capital letters, paradoxically appears directly underneath the silhouette's body, which blocks our view of the Northern warships, a central element of the Alabama loyalist scene. Walker's silhouette figure instead draws our attention to the image of a Black boy who crawls on the ground at lower right, near the silhouetted woman's right foot, and looks up towards her as he might look towards his mother. The silhouette's pose notably resembles that of the boy. It is as though she has tripped or been tripped and is now on her knees, but she's still in motion, although it's unclear whether she's still falling or trying to stand back up. Walker's silhouette figures underline not just the violence against Black people represented by the anthology's images, but also the perpetuation of this violence to this day. Their forms are based on racial stereotypes that still exist. Moreover, as shadowy forms with little individuality, these figures are not restricted to a particular time period, but rather exist across time. Formally, they recall silhouette portraits like these. Next, I think it's on the next slide, that were popular in the United States from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Whereas these portraits represent particular individuals, were produced singularly, and were intended for private viewing, Walker's silhouettes are more generic, produced in multiple, and intended for a public audience. In addition, Walker's silhouette figures are not made of cutout paper, as these older silhouette portraits are, but instead have been printed using a technique called screen print. To reproduce the Harper's illustrations, Walker has used offset lithography, a printmaking technique that has allowed her to retain the look of the original wood engravings from Harper's. The solid Black forms of Walker's superimposed silhouettes contrast with the line-based aesthetic of the Harper's images. By using printmaking techniques that allow her images to be produced in multiple, Walker plays on the reproducibility of the Harper's images, which were widely disseminated. She challenges Harper's imagery with her own reproducible images, which both visually and conceptually intervene with the Harper's narrative. Nowhere is the layeredness and complexity of the history that Walker is evoking more apparent than in this print, Exodus of the Confederates from Atlanta. Inside the silhouette portrait of a Black woman appears a cutout portrait of a Black man, which frames a lithographic image of a Black boy. The print depicts a family portrait of sorts, mother, father, and child, perhaps in allusion to the inheritance of racial inequality and trauma from generation to generation. This print visualizes the layered nature of history, both personal and societal, and encourages the questioning, critiquing, and rewriting of historical narratives so that they convey a more complete story that reflects the different perspectives and experiences of the many peoples involved. With that, I'll hand it over to Jenna to discuss Carrie Mae Weems' work.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Marvin, and I am the fellow in the photography department. Thank you, Alyssa, for your analysis of Walker's prints. The American Civil War holds a special place in my own scholarship, and I'm eager to put Walker's portfolio in dialogue with the work of Carrie Mae Weems today. There are many points of contact between these two bodies of work as both artists critique historical narratives that have excluded the experiences of Black people. Today, as part of the theme of imaging histories of enslavement, I would like to share with you all selections from a series of works entitled Slave Coast by the American artist Carrie Mae Weems. We see before us 3 photographs and 3 lines of text. The square black and white photographs depict the same architectural feature, a double staircase from different angles, yet no single photograph captures the structure in its entirety. Banisters and individual stairs are cropped off at the edges as if the monumental staircase is too large to be contained by each photograph's frame. The 3 photographs are stacked one on top of the other, so the viewer's eye ascends and descends the stairs in place of their physical body. The text, printed in red script on warm cream-colored paper alongside the photographs, reads, Elmina, Cape Coast, Ile de Gorée, 3 significant places in the history of the transatlantic slave trade on the west coast of Africa. This particular staircase is located on the island of Gorée, off the coast of Dakar, Senegal, in a museum which is now called the House of Slaves. The bright doorway between the 2 sets of stairs in the top photograph is colloquially called the Door of No Return, as enslaved people were ushered through this door and onto ships bound for the Americas. A photographer and multimedia artist, Weems visited the west coast of Africa in the early 1990s to photograph both ancient and colonial structures. In a lecture at the Brooklyn Museum in 2010, Weems pointed to her exploration of buildings and material culture as the beginning of her long-standing interest in what she calls the architecture of slavery. She described the colonial castles built to house enslaved people on the west coast of Africa as, quote, an architecture completely set up in order to develop one of the most sophisticated and one of the most brutal trades that took place in the 18th and 19th centuries, that of slavery, end quote. For Weems, architectural structures are, quote, emblems of power, end quote, that limit who may enter a space and how a space may be used. Weems would continue to explore this idea in a more recent work. In a print from her 2006 series Museums, Weems photographed herself from behind in front of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, a building known for its undulating metallic cladding. Designed by the Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry, the Guggenheim's website characterizes the building as, quote, a magnificent example of the most groundbreaking 20th century architecture, end quote. In this series, Weems is asking us, quote, who is in and who is out, while poignantly signaling that she, as a Black woman, is out, unwelcome as a visitor, as an artist in the collection, and even as a subject of most of the art on display. She is blocked from the museum both by the white railing in front of her, as well as the estuary of Bilbao that runs between her and the museum like the moat of a medieval castle. When speaking about her decision to include herself within the frame, Weems says, quote, I'm trying to use my little body to stand in for all that's somehow left out. As in the works from Slave Coast, Weems crops the Guggenheim's building, bisecting the multi-story glass entryway on the right and clipping the building's edge on the left, a fracturing that undermines the Guggenheim's claim that their building is a groundbreaking example of 20th century architecture, since we cannot see the structure in its entirety. Weems is intentionally playing with how monumental modern structures are photographed, but to better understand the kind of intervention Weems is making in Slave Coast, we should turn to the work of one of the most revered architectural photographers of the 20th century, the American photographer Ezra Stoller. Trained in architecture and industrial design, as well as photography, Ezra Stoller took photographs of some of the 20th century's most well-known buildings by architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. In 1955, he took this photograph of the Le Corbusier designed church Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp, France, which translates to Our Lady from Above. Stoller aims his camera lens down a wide corridor. The passage feels open and expansive as the wood of the ceiling slopes and bends as if it were fabric flapping in a breeze. A monk stands at the end of the corridor, staring into the bright light that trickles around the corner, just out of the camera's sight. The smooth slope of the ceiling and inviting light at the end of the passage seem to push the viewer down the hall, toward the tentative and soft promise of daylight at the end. While Weems does capture similar architectural settings in the series Slave Coast, her aims are quite different than Stoller's. In this work, Weems pairs 2 views down dark corridors with the text, grabbing, snatching, blink, and you be gone, situated between the 2 photographs. Though both passageways promise daylight at the end, the feeling of sacred calm that permeates Stoller's image is not present here. Though Weems' photographs also push the viewer toward the light, it is not a reprieve, but instead a symbol of cruelty and the unknown, a door of no return. Stoller's daughter, the artist Erica Stoller, wrote that her father, quote, believed in the honest ability of photography to reveal the structure, function, and material qualities of a building. His commitment to the visual transcended the need for words. If one could look at an image, then text was redundant, end quote. Weems' pairing of text and image in the series Slave Coast refutes this claim. Photographs of structures alone cannot reveal the cruel history of these sites, and the text serves as a reminder not only of history as it is recorded in history books, but of the lived experience of the Black enslaved figures who would have walked down these passageways. Weems has often stated that one of her goals of her practice is to insert bodies that had been left out. In the series Museums, Weems projects her own body onto a background of architectural splendor, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, fragmented but monumental nonetheless. In Slave Coast, she asks us to imagine the Black bodies that move through these spaces, through the arrangement of the photographs and the inclusion of text, as well as through the visual language of architectural photography, a language that often does not account for the lived experiences of those who occupied or were excluded from these structures. And with that, I know that Alyssa and I have a few questions for each other, but please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you so much for your talk, Jenna. I'm so fascinated by how often bodies, like no bodies are visible in Weems' photographs, but there's still a sense of human presence that almost haunts the images. And I know you were just talking about the role of the text and kind of calling attention to that, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, you know, the erasure of the body, or sometimes, you know, the presence of the body in these works and what role bodies are playing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that Weems is actively thinking about that, both through how she uses the camera. The camera is almost always at eye level. And so in some ways, a body, a viewer is implied through where the camera is positioned when she's taking these photographs. But also, she's thinking about architecture, and to think about architecture is to think about the way that people move through spaces. You know, buildings are occupied by people and they are designed to be moved through. And so in some ways, to think about architecture photography is to think about how bodies move through space. And so it's impossible to photograph these buildings without thinking about the people that have moved through them and who they were made for. Yeah. That it leads me to a different question, one for you, because I've been thinking a lot about image and text, and I'm struck by the role of text in both of these bodies of work. In most of the works in Slave Coast, Weems pairs photographs with text, but in Walker's case, some of the titles of the original wood engravings are partially obscured, I noticed, thinking specifically about the exodus of Confederates from Atlanta. How do you think that Walker is using text here, especially considering how the wood engravings were originally made to be distributed in an illustrated newspaper like Harper's, and in the pictorial history, they are accompanied by text as well?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think Kara Walker she's really interested in the relationship between the text and the image, particularly in the Harper's publications. This idea of an image caption somehow conveying a meaning that relates to what's in the visual illustration. And as you noted in Exodus of the Confederates from Atlanta, the silhouette figure actually covers part of that text. So all you read is actually just Exodus of, and then I think you see the C and the O maybe, but you don't know the rest of the text. And similarly, the silhouette is also blocking parts of the illustration that image caption is referring to. So she's disrupting both the text and the visual that accompanies that text. Here in this image we see on this slide in Alabama Loyalists, the silhouette figure doesn't cover the text, so we actually get the full Harper's image caption, but she's obscuring important parts of the illustration that accompanies it. You know, the text reads Alabama Loyalists greeting the federal gunboats, but the gunboats aren't really visible. We can see the smoke, but the boats themselves are obscured by the figure. So I think she's disrupting the different narratives, both the textual narratives and the visual narratives in the Harper's illustrations. And by doing that, she's kind of drawing attention to how meaning is mutable, both textual and visual. Meaning is mutable. It's changeable. You can erase it. You can write over it. You can rewrite it. And so I think that's a really important part of her work as she's trying to, you know, kind of write Black people back into this American history from which they've largely been erased or marginalized. So I think it's so interesting that in Kara Walker's work, the text and the image are kind of side by side on the same page. And in Weems, I wanted to ask you about this. The text is kind of separate. It's part of the same work, but it kind of gets its own space, and it's a little more separated. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the way that Weems uses text. She separates it. It's often all capitalized letters. Sometimes it's in a different color. Can you kind of talk about what she's doing, and what role that text is how that text is functioning?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I teach with these works quite a bit, and I often ask students, does it matter that the text is included here as its own sort of frame if it's in the title? Like, what does that mean? She could have titled the work, for instance, Grabbing, Snatching, Blank, and You Be Gone, and that is the title of the work. But why is it important for her to insert that text next to the photographs as its own sort of object within a constellation of other objects? And for me, I feel like it functions in two ways. The paper is a pretty warm color. It's kind of a beige off-white, and the text is in red. And so you have this comparison between the very cool palette of the black and white photographs and the warmth of the text, which is, almost flipped, right? You think about text being black ink on white paper, and that's not the case here. And it's also interesting in that, particularly this image on the screen, the staircase from Elmina, Cape Coast and Ile de Gorée, that staircase is actually a bright pink in real life. The stucco is very vibrant. And so her choice to kind of take color out of the photographs and kind of bring the warmth and color into the text, I think it's definitely worth noting. And thinking about the title versus the text actually as part of the work, those texts provide really important context, and it's not a simple list or bits of historical fact. There's a lyrical and like a spoken word element to these texts as well. There are no commas. The way they're placed on the page, they look almost like poetic verse more than they look like prose. And that, to me, adds something narrative. It adds something that's kind of beyond this ahistorical narration of the Atlantic slave trade. It inserts some subjectivity into these views. And I think that she's doing that through the photographs, but the text is definitely another way that that's working as well. Yeah.
So interesting. That's so interesting. I didn't realize that the steps were actually a bright pink in real life. That's so fascinating, because I mean, obviously she's working nowadays. She could use color photography if she wanted to, but she's specifically chosen black and white.
Yeah, and she's someone who's thinking so much about artificial color in photography. She has a whole series of works called Colored People that have these very bright, like purples and yellows over top of a monochrome print of Black people, on this idea of what is color and like how is that formally operating in her work. And that's something she's definitely known for. And she does that over top of 19th century photographs as well. In her series, From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. So she's very consciously thinking about taking color away and then putting it back in a way that isn't necessarily natural. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting.
And I have one more question for you about the Walker. It's so interesting how large they are, considering how small the wood engravings would be if you were looking at a vintage copy of Harper's Weekly. Could you talk a little bit about the size? And I'm sure that you have handled them at some point, and like what that's like, since we're not in the study room together.
Yeah, so actually the virtual actually gives us a really great opportunity in this instant to pull out this portfolio that in the study room would be challenging. It takes two people to handle this like extremely large blue box that houses these prints, and 3 by 4.5 feet or whatever, or whatever they are. It doesn't sound that big, but when it comes to a stack of 15 prints in a box, it's quite heavy. So it takes two people to handle it, and then we have to display them flat, because if they're not framed, they're not matted. They're not framed, so there's no way to put them upright. So it's actually these prints, the portfolio comes out all the time for classes, but it's actually really a challenge. It's every time to kind of pull it and get it kind of appropriately on the table and viewable. Sometimes you kind of have to stand on a chair to really look at them in the study room. So I'm glad you bring up the size, because I think size and monumentality are kind of a key part of Kara Walker's work in general. You think of her silhouettes, her wall pieces, and those are like pretty much usually life size, pretty much. I also think of a project that she did in New York a couple years ago that some of you might have seen, called Sugar Baby, and where she made these like humongous sculptures out of sugar in this warehouse in Brooklyn. And those were kind of larger. Most of those were larger than life size, and they had their own quality to them because they were sugar and they melted over time and you could smell it. There's this whole kind of full body experience. And I think that's something that's really important to Walker and a lot of her work. There's this full body engagement. And you can imagine that if these large scale prints were mounted on a wall in a gallery, you see them from across the room, you approach them, you kind of come head to head with them and you're a similar size. These are a little bit smaller than life size, but still there's kind of a physical engagement that her works demand because they are so large, especially the silhouettes in these prints are so large. And I think you're right that the Harpers weren't originally smaller, although at that time it was considered a sizable publication, but certainly by comparison to Walker's prints, they're tiny. But it's an entirely different viewing experience. When someone was reading Harper's pictorial history, you were sitting, it was probably on a table in front of you, maybe your lap. They're a little large for that, but you could handle them. Walker's works are very different. It's not a private viewing experience. These are really museum pieces, gallery pieces. You're seeing them in a public space and you're approaching them on your feet. So I think Walker is really interested in that very active physical engagement with her work and the figures in her work.
Yeah, it's incredible how much you can also see the wood engraving. They're so meticulously made, and there's so many small details that if it was printed on a folded page like Harper's Weekly would have been published during the war, you kind of lose some of the detail. I'm thinking especially in this one, loyalists greeting the federal gunboats, all of the figures that kind of swarm between Walker's silhouetted figure and that tree that rises kind of in the middle ground. You lose so much detail when it's small, and by making it large, it's kind of manifesting kind of the inner workings of the print. You see the lines more clearly. You can ascertain how it's made a little bit easier, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that the image still reads as clear, even though it's been enlarged. I mean, it's enormously enlarged, like compared to the original images, but it still reads as clear. And like you said, you can see the lines. And those kind of lines really contrast with the silhouette figure, which is a solid black. I mean, screen print really lets you print things solid because you're using a mesh with these teeny tiny holes, and you blocked out the area around the figure so the ink just goes through the screen where those holes are open. And the mesh is so tiny that the figure ends up appearing as kind of a solid color, a solid black color. So it really contrasts the technique she's using, really allow her to kind of contrast these two different overlaid images. Can you talk a little bit about Weems's work? I actually don't know the frames that they're in. I know we keep them framed in the gallery, and I'm just wondering kind of why we keep them framed, and whether the frames are artist frames, or do and also the way that Weems has stipulated that the photographs be arranged within the various pieces. Can you talk a little bit about that and the kind of physical experience and the installation part of it?
Yeah, definitely. As far as I believe, I don't know if they're artist frames or not, but because the arrangement of the works is so key to understanding the works, it makes a lot of sense to keep them framed and to kind of preserve that part of the work and the arrangement. Jake, would it be possible to go back to the last slide of mine with the installation image? All possible. The installation image, there it is. That's actually Weems there looking at these works. This is from a hang that accompanied a performance of her work in 2016 called Grace Notes, Reflections for Now. And you can see there's all sorts of different ways that each work is laid out. Some are laid out in kind of a linear fashion. The one Elmina, Cape Coast, Ile de Gorée, is laid out in an L shape. There are a couple where the square frames for the photo and the text are missized. They're not completely matched. And there's some where they're not all hung in a line. And so each piece kind of has this very special arrangement that feels targeted to each building, to each text. And it's, you know, I feel kind of the same way about the Weems as you do the Walkers, because they're framed. It's hard to preserve that feeling of really how Weems wants them to be shown in the study room, because they're, you know, they're large, and it's hard to kind of map out how they're supposed to look on a wall in the study room. And so this is kind of a really good opportunity to look at these works on a screen as they're installed and kind of get the full experience, or not full experience, but as full as it can be over Zoom, to see how these works would be hung and how they would be experienced in museum spaces. Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a question in the chat about how sometimes Weems multi-panel works are displayed differently. I wonder if that has to do with the fact that it's just kind of in certain spaces, it's hard to display them as she would like, or whether sometimes people, you know, I think that it's not always visually apparent when you look at the works to know the arrangement. It's not intuitive. I mean, especially the L shape of that one series. I mean, that strikes me every time. That's not necessarily the way I would intuitively hang the work if I hadn't spoken with Weems about how she wanted it displayed. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that when I was thinking about what I wanted to say about Weems' work and what my intervention, what I wanted it to be in this talk, was thinking about the ways that these were arranged. And to me, it was sort of a tip off that she's thinking about movement through space and also how your eye moves over her work, and thinking about the viewer's eye ascending and descending that staircase next to the text, I think is really important. And you wouldn't have that same sense of the verticality of a staircase if that piece was laid out horizontally and just, you know, 4 separate squares. I think it's really key. Yeah.
We got a couple questions while you two were talking.
Sure.
And you touched on some things that folks were asking about, but returning to this thread about black and white and color, someone asked, in Weems's work, could it be that the red text and warm paper color evoke the human element, which is intentionally eliminated from the black and white photographs? In other words, it introduces the absent humans, real people, who are erased in looking only at the photograph, which is representing a historical past era. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's one way to read it. The only reason that the only pause that I would put on that is thinking about, I have students sometimes describe that cream colored paper as flesh toned. And my response to that is, well, whose flesh? You know, it's anyone with flesh that color, you know, they could be white or white passing. And I think that Weems is in explicit point is thinking about black bodies that move through these spaces and their erasure. And so I think that there's like a warmth and an organicness that the text implies, but I think that it's also important to realize the color of that paper, I'm sure, is very intentional, and it doesn't actually reflect the figures that she's trying to kind of make manifest in the photographs. But yeah, it's an excellent point. Yeah.
Thank you. And then there's one more question about one of the Weems works, and then there's a question for Alyssa about Kara Walker. So this person asks, whoops, let's see if I can get back to this image. So in this image, is the handwritten sign legible? It looks like the first word is penser, or think.
It is legible. It says, think of our works. It's a tip box.
Oh, okay. That's
really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot, and how that it kind of points to this place's after history as a museum. you know, this isn't a place frozen in time. This museum is actually really historiographically important to commemorating the Atlantic slave trade. Scholars don't quite agree on how many enslaved people were held or imprisoned in this space, but it has taken on a huge sort of pilgrimage function. Nelson Mandela had visited this space when he was alive, and there's this incredibly moving picture of the Obamas standing in the door of no return. I think they went on a trip maybe 2013. And so, you know, think of our works, this kind of preservation of this space, that historical memory is implied in this photograph, and that this has a life, a commemorative life far beyond the end of the Atlantic slave trade in the 19th century. Like, definitely a good catch. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't even noticed that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So then a couple of questions have come in about Kara Walker. And the first one is, concerning the monumentality of Kara Walker's works, does Walker draw upon both the visual and symbolic power of historical monumental sculptures of white Europeans, but invert that to give visibility to enslaved Black Africans? Or is there another origin to the monumentality of Walker's works?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought much about sculpture. That's interesting. I think there are many dimensions to the monumentality of Kara Walker's work. I think a lot of it is just, you know, establishing this presence that you just can't miss, you just can't avoid, you know, especially since the silhouette figures in these prints are so much larger than even the figures in the Harper's illustrations behind. The silhouette figures stand out and they're unmissable. You have to confront them. Life size, you have to confront them. Physically, you're approaching them. There's no way around it, or there's no way around those bodies, around those figures. And I think that's really important to her. As for kind of the tradition, you know, art historical references, I think they're manifold. Certainly the silhouette portraits that we mentioned earlier, which are quite tiny, actually. They're generally like just, you know, several inches by several inches. These were really generally quite small. So she's referencing these. She's probably just she's certainly referencing portraiture in general. I could imagine she's certainly thinking about, you know, the scale of a lot of portraits throughout European art history. They were often large scale. You often, you know, if you go to any museum and you look at, you know, Spanish portraiture, French portraiture, you name it, often the portraits are life size or close to life size. So I'm sure she's thinking about that and that history, and doing exactly what you suggest, kind of subverting that by inverting that by giving visibility to enslaved Black Africans. But the question about sculpture is interesting, especially since Kara Walker does sometimes work with sculpture, and her works, especially her wall works and also the Sugar Babies work that she did, is all, you know, kind of sculptural in many ways. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's an element of that. Although I think it's interesting that the silhouettes are so flat. In a way, they're sculptural. In a way, they're dimensional. But they're also like, it's kind of as flat as it gets because there's no gradation, no sense of three-dimensionality within the figures themselves.
Although it is interesting that this one has a shadow, this image on the right. So there is like a materiality to it in a way.
Yeah. And I think in Walker's work, you start to get the dimensionality when you have the silhouette layered on the background. So the silhouette's bigger and it's also layered on top, so it appears closer to us. So she's creating dimensionality and layers of space in that way.
It's also about density too, like the really, you know, the lack of sort of shadow and tone on the silhouettes provides them with a heaviness as well, like that absolutely uniform black. You were talking about the screen print. While they don't kind of give us three-dimensionality in the way that maybe some of the modeled figures in the wood engravings behind them do, they're heavy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
All right, we're getting a number of questions, so let's keep it going. Alyssa, this is another question about Walker. This person writes, "It seems to me that Walker does a really good job at using a scene to look at an event from multiple viewpoints. So I don't know if there are like formal or conceptual strategies that you'd want to talk about in terms of like this idea of multiple viewpoints converging in a single image.
Yeah, if we were in the study room, I would ask I would ask what you mean when you ask that, because there's so many different directions that we could go in. Um, Literally, in terms of different viewpoints, I'm having more trouble kind of formulating an answer, but certainly conceptually, you're getting the kind of historical viewpoint of the Harper's images overlayered by the contemporary viewpoint of her silhouette figures. And like we were just mentioning, they're kind of in two different spaces, but also in dialogue with one another. So I think you're absolutely right that she is using a single image to kind of incorporate these different temporal moments as well as spatial moments.
I might add to that really quickly and think about when I look at these, when you think about Harper's, the original context of where these were displayed, it's all of these sort of news images about the Civil War, and oftentimes they don't contain Black figures. When you think about the context of the Civil War is being fought in, Black figures are a huge part of, you know, slavery is the question of the Civil War. And so for Walker to insert a large and like dense Black figure is to point out in some ways the obvious omission, that it's multiple viewpoints, but in some ways it's the chief viewpoint that's missing. There's an absurdity to having these sort of Civil War engravings that don't talk about enslavement and don't feature Black figures. It's almost absurd.
And just to kind of follow up on that, Jenna, you're making me think of how the silhouette figures are not part of in Kara Walker's work, the silhouette figures are not part of the scene behind. They often kind of relate. So like here in this image, she's relating to the figure, the Black boy on the ground in the Harper's illustration, but she's in a totally separate space. She's not part of the loyalists rushing to the war boats. And kind of looking at this image also makes me think that formally, you're seeing the crowd rushing to the warships, but you also see the Black boy who's looking in a totally different direction. So maybe this might be what you mean by viewpoints if you're thinking about it visually, is you have the viewpoint of the Black boy, and it's different than the viewpoint of a lot of the other figures in the Harper's illustration looking towards the ships. And the Black boy is looking, in this case, seems to be looking at the silhouette figure that Walker has overlaid, which I think is kind of her way of, in this image, of connecting that silhouette figure with the scene behind without her becoming part of that scene. She's still kind of independent in her own independent, separate space. And something that I want to mention about this image, because I think it's super important, is that the silhouette figure's blocking the warships. It's also blocking a dog that's running towards the shore. We don't see it here. It's kind of behind her legs. But what I found really interesting when I was looking at that original image is that the dog is running, and so its form kind of mimics that of the Black boy, which is obviously extremely demeaning to the boy. And so I thought that it was really interesting that Walker decides to cover up that dog figure and instead put this figure of a woman, so it becomes almost a maternal relationship between the silhouette figure and the boy, instead of this relationship between the Black boy and this dog.
That's a really poignant point. It's not just about insertion of the silhouetted figures. To insert the silhouetted figure, you have to exclude and omit what is behind it. And so there's kind of two sides to that decision of where and how and what silhouetted figure to include. Yeah.
It's so important. What she's covering up is so right. Important. Where she places those figures, and it changes in every print in the portfolio. It's so deliberate.
Yeah.
That was great. Thank you both for that lovely thread. We have just a couple more minutes, but we got two questions that are possibly related. So the first question is, thank you, Jenna and Alyssa, for your beautiful conversation surrounding these works and artists. I'm wondering what you both think about the role of water in these images. A small sliver of ocean is visible in Weems's work. And Elissa mentioned the obscured but referred to ships in Walker's. And then someone else asked about, and possibly this is a separate conversation, about Walker's recent fountain at the Tate, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but thinking about like, yeah, the role of water that courses through all of these works.
I'll go ahead and start. It's interesting pointing out the water. I think that the water in some ways is, because you see it through that door of no return, it's kind of beyond, it's unknowable. And I wish I had an image of it in the PowerPoint, but there is one work in the Slave Coast series that has color. And it is two photographs of the ocean, and they're just really, really deep blue. Like really, really deep blue. And so kind of back to the earlier conversation Alyssa and I were having about color, Weems is very, 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 very explicit about taking color away and adding color in. And so the water takes on this almost mythical blue. Like water is not that blue, and there's a richness to it, and it frames, I believe, a image of, I think, carved figures in between, is the black and white photograph in between them. And this idea of water closing in, but also water that is, it doesn't read as like real water. It doesn't read as necessarily the Atlantic Ocean writ large. It kind of reads as this mystical element that water takes on, which makes a lot of sense in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. The Atlantic and the Black Atlantic has been theorized as this really sort of interesting point of contact between Africa, the Americas, and Europe through the slave trade, and the Atlantic is in the center of that narrative. And I think Weems is very much playing on that formally and conceptually in this series as well. That's an excellent point about water. It's very important.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think that water, so the obvious reference, or maybe the primary reference, is to the transatlantic slave trade, right? You know, the Atlantic is so central to what both of these artists are talking about. The literal transport of bodies across the ocean, the thousands, I don't know the number, but like
millions
yeah. The people who passed away on that journey, let alone once they got across to the Americas. So I think that water is really important in that respect. But in this particular image, water was also extremely important during the Civil War. And Jenna, I'm sure you can speak to this more than I can because it's really your time period, but to think about the importance of gunboats. I mean, the federal gunboats in this particular instance, in kind of Alabama, Tennessee, were crucial to the North kind of taking back certain strongholds and certain forts in those locations during the Civil War. So the travel up rivers, like rivers in particular, were, as well as, you know, the actual Atlantic Ocean, were really important during the Civil War. Gunboat supplies, like all of that water was important in that respect. Also in Kara Walker's print portfolio, other images often have kind of lagoons, lakes, ponds, I don't know exactly what to call them, but other sorts of bodies of water, sometimes with drowning figures, sometimes with the implication that figures are drowning, sometimes with people fishing. So I think that Kara Walker is interested in water as both this potential danger, but also as this this way of transporting things, you know, a means of transportation, potentially a means of escape. Slaves who are trying to escape, maybe they sometimes hid in the water. So I think water is really complicated, has so many different meanings. As for the fountain that she recently did that's at the Tate Modern, I actually wasn't familiar with that until you mentioned it, but I quickly kind of Googled it and came right up. A really interesting piece, and as you note, it really is in a very European style, but obviously the content is very different than traditional European sculpture. So it's super interesting, and again, I think she's referencing primarily the transatlantic slave trade in that particular piece. But I would have to kind of do more research on it to speak more to that. But I think that piece kind of opens a whole nother can of worms, because obviously she's talking, that is really fitting into a sculptural tradition, the tradition of the fountain and European gardens. I mean, that opens a whole nother can of worms that I don't think we really have time, unfortunately, to discuss, but a super interesting piece. And yeah, again, just the importance of water across both of the artist's work.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that piece seems to have been based on the Victoria Memorial in front of Buckingham Palace in London, which is kind of like an allegorical celebration of like the Victorian Empire. And Walker's sculpture is kind of like subverting that with like allegorical representations of the transatlantic slave trade, also playing with like, again, like stereotypes and kind of like these mythical like racial figures. But yeah, and of course water is like circulating through the fountain because it's a fountain.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's also interesting that it's sort of on these different layers of pedestal almost. It's an interesting piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're approaching the end of our time, but I wanted to see if either of you had kind of comments or things you wanted to mention that came up from the conversation, or just think questions or ideas to leave our visitors with.
I think the multiple viewpoints question is actually, I'm going to be thinking about that the rest of today, and thinking about how that question can be turned on Weems' work as well, and thinking about how we should approach more artwork with that kind of question in mind, you know, beyond Walker and Weems, but thinking about how we can think about multiple perspectives in a lot of the work that we see, both through what has been omitted and like who is being omitted and what. I think is really an interesting thought to leave on. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, thank you both
very
so much for sharing your expertise and for these engaging presentations.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll hope to see everyone at the gallery, if not in the study room specifically, soon when it's safe.
Definitely.
All right.